Week 7 of the fantasy football season. His quarterback sits every matchup this week. Thursday night, Denver Broncos at the New Orleans Saints. Bo Nix, he's looked decent in terms of fantasy points over the last couple weeks. The last two games, 25 or more fantasy points for Bo Nix. I know last week was a lot of garbage time in that one versus the Los Angeles Chargers in Denver. And this week, this is a pretty good defense, even though I know last week they got the doors blown off 51-27. But Bo Nix, we have to see a little bit more out of him, more consistency. The only thing with Bo Nix, he does get a decent amount of points on the ground, anywhere from 4 to 7 points per week, running the football and possibly scoring touchdowns. But this week, with almost a full slate, he's a quarterback I would sit. Spencer Rattler, I believe, is going to start once again in this one. And this is going to be a tougher matchup versus Bronco defense. I know the Chargers went into Denver and had a good ball game and a good game plan, and Surtain left early with a concussion, where I don't believe Surtain is going to play in this one. But now with Chris Olave most likely out with the concussion, even though he missed the majority of last week's game, I think it's going to be tough for Spencer Rattler and this Bronco defense. They're usually good with younger quarterbacks. New England Patriots at the Jaguars in London. Drake May's a sit. Drake May, I know, went out there, had a good ball game. They moved the football well, but also another ball game where it was garbage time and they lost 41-21 versus the Houston Texans in last week's game. So May, he don't have many weapons, but Demario Douglas had a nice ball game. 90 yards, found the end zone in that one. Hunter Henry found the end zone on 3 catches, 41 yards. So they got some weapons over there in New England, but traveling cross country, I have to see a little bit more from May, especially with a full slate pretty much to put him in the lineup. Trevor Lawrence, a borderline option. Lawrence, the last couple weeks, his numbers have gone up a little bit, even though this Jacksonville Jaguar team 1-5 on the season. And it was good to see Evan Ingram back in the lineup for Jacksonville, where he had 10 catches for 102 yards. To have him back in the lineup, Gabe Davis scoring 2 touchdowns last week. I think Lawrence, in a beatable matchup in London, is a borderline option. Detroit Lions at the Minnesota Vikings. Jared Goff, he's locked in. I know this is a tough matchup, no doubt about it, in Minnesota. One of the better defenses so far in the early going. But Jared Goff, when you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, a deep ball threat like Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, even though his numbers have dropped off big time this season, and even Tim Patrick's getting into the mix of things the last couple of weeks. Goff is a quarterback I would start, and I could see this being a potential shootout, even though I know this Viking team, they hold opponents down, they create turnovers and make plays. But Jared Goff's locked in, and this Lion team's locked in. Sam Darnold, the start for me as well. I know it was a tough matchup a few weeks ago in London versus New York Jets, where he only had 4 fantasy points, and that was Darnold. But now, coming off the bye week, Detroit, their defense has given up some points this season, even though I know last week they shut down Dak Prescott. But now with Hutchinson out, most likely for the rest of the season, that's a big void to fill for this Lion defense. And I think Sam Darnold, with Justin Jefferson, obviously, and Jordan Addison, who's a decent receiver, could exploit that secondary a little bit and make plays. Tennessee Titans at the Buffalo Bills. Will Levis is a sit. He really hasn't shown much this season. A lot of questionable throws, inaccurate, and just not putting points on the board. So he's an easy sit. Allen's a start each and every week. I know this season it's been a mixed bag of results for Allen, and he don't really have a true number 1 wide receiver, but still with the parts he has on this roster, he's going out there making plays. His running ability as well adds an extra 8-10 fantasy points most weeks for Josh Allen. And this week versus Tennessee, even though they're a pretty decent defense for the most part, he's matchup proof and was the first quarterback in most leagues to come off the board. Miami Dolphins at the Indianapolis Colts. Tyler Huntley's a sit. Maybe he improves a little bit coming off the bye and learning the playbook more, since he's only been there a month about Tyler Huntley, but still not a quarterback I have confidence in. This Colt defense, we've seen them take advantage of the most part versus weaker quarterbacks over the last couple seasons, and Huntley's ceiling really isn't that high, even though he's another quarterback that's mobile and could get yards on the ground. Richardson's in. He's a borderline option to me, because Anthony Richardson, he don't really get a lot of passing yards. He don't really get a lot of attempts. I know he has a lot of upside running the football, is Anthony Richardson, but we haven't seen much of that either this season. And I believe Joe Flacco gives this Colt team a better chance of winning and helps the guys like Josh Downs and Michael Pittman for fantasy football way more than Anthony Richardson. Seattle Seahawks at the Falcons. Geno Smith, I'm getting the starting nod to. Last week, I know wasn't a great week for Geno, but this week a pretty favorable matchup in the Atlanta Falcons, where I don't think their defense is all that good. So Geno Smith, when you got a DK Metcalf, JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Tyler Lockett, Noah Fant on the offense, who's been a pretty good tight end this season on and off, and Kenneth Walker, who's a good receiving back with Charbonnet out of the backfield, you're going to get fantasy points and sometimes just get into it, obviously, with yards after catch, from the players I mentioned. So the Atlanta Falcons secondary hasn't been all that great, especially the last couple of weeks. We saw Tampa go in there, put up points on Thursday night a few weeks ago. I think Geno Smith in this matchup indoors, where I think the game's always more high scoring, is a start. Kirk Cousins a start as well. We know 2 weeks ago came off the monster game, 509 yards, 4 touchdowns versus Tampa Bay. And then last week it was a pedestrian type of game for Kirk Cousins, where he did have over 200 yards and found the end zone, but only had 14 fantasy points was Kirk Cousins and 6 passing touchdown leads. But Cousins has a great weapons. Him and Drake London on the same page. Darnell Mooney's been solid for the most part this season, even though he had an off game last week. Kyle Pitts has been all right, and Ray McLeod's been a decent number 3 wide receiver. Robinson and Algier being decent receiving backs out of the backfield. So this week in a potential shootout, I like both quarterbacks, and Kirk Cousins is a start this week. This matchup, Houston Texans at the Green Bay Packers. CJ Stroud, he's a must-start each and every week. Last couple weeks, his numbers have gone up. I know Nico Collins out of the lineup at least a few more weeks with the hamstring injury, and this week a tougher matchup at Green Bay, unlike last week versus the Patriots. But when you got Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, Joe Mixon back in the lineup who can catch the football out of the backfield, CJ Stroud's locked in, and he was a top 5-6 quarterback off the board in most fantasy drafts. Jordan Love locked in as well as a starter. Since he's been back, he's thrown a lot of touchdowns as Jordan Love. I know the interceptions have been up there as well, but he's a gunslinger. He's not scared of getting that football down the field, and he's got good weapons. Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Tucker Kraft, Josh Jacobs out of the backfield. So this could be a potential shootout this week, and both these quarterbacks to start. Cincinnati Bengals at the Cleveland Browns. Joe Burrow will start. I know last week wasn't a monster game for Joe Burrow, but he made up for a little bit for it with a big 47-yard rushing touchdown where no one was around in the secondary once he hit that second level. So Joe Burrow, he's been great this season. Great weapons, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. Ray Ozavis has been a decent number 3 wide receiver. And then in the backfield, Zach Moss and the Chase Brown tandem for the Cincinnati Bengal team. So Joe Burrow this week in a matchup, a team he's very familiar with, going to the dog pound. I think he could go in there once again and be a decent option. Deshaun Watson, that's it. We've seen nothing from Deshaun Watson over the last couple seasons. His best years are behind him. He's not in sync with his receivers. He's not throwing an accurate football. And just bad body language overall. I know the Cincinnati defense isn't all that great, even though they held the Giants offense down to 7 points. But Deshaun Watson, he's a sit weekly. Philadelphia Eagles at the Giants. Jalen Hurts, he's locked in as a starter. Top 2 wide receivers back in the last week's ball game versus the Cleveland Browns, and this week versus a beatable secondary of the New York Giants in division rival, where Hurts has had a good career versus Giant team. I think he goes out there and has one of his better games of the season. Daniel Jones a sit. Daniel Jones, I know he gets a lot of ground yards and fantasy points, but he just can't find the end zone throwing the football consistently. I know Malik Neighbors possibly could return in this ball game after missing the last 2 with a concussion, but this week Daniel Jones, in a last week in a plus matchup, I thought he was going to be decent, but he didn't do much in that ball game. He's a sit. Vegas Raiders at the Rams. Hayden O'Connell's a sit. We'll see if Davante Adams comes back in this game, but I believe he'll either be traded or sit out another week or 2 till that hamstring's 100%, and Hayden O'Connell really hasn't done much. Besides Brock Bowers, this offense doesn't have much unless Adams comes back, like I said. And I know this Ram team, their defense hasn't been great this season, but they're coming off a bye and getting some players back in the mix as well, so he's a sit. Matthew Stafford to start. This is a great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders, one of the worst defenses in the league. And Cooper Kupp most likely coming back this week as well, where this was always the plan for Cooper Kupp to rest, come back after the bye week, and maybe this Ram team try to make a late run this season, even though they're way down there in the standings. So Matthew Stafford with his number 1 weapon most likely back in the lineup is a start. Panthers at the Commanders. Andy Dalton is hit. I know Andy Dalton's been pretty solid with 3 out of the 4 starts for him this season, 20 or more fantasy points for Andy Dalton. But this week a matchup with the Commanders, their defense is improving a little by little each week for this Commander team. Even Lamar Jackson last week, he had a good game, no doubt about it, versus the Commanders, but he didn't have those elite numbers like he usually puts up, is Lamar Jackson, in terms of running and putting the touchdowns. He did pass the football well, but Andy Dalton, like you said, we know he's a gunslinger. We know he's got decent weapons. Deontay Johnson, Xavier Legette, Chuba Hubbard out of the backfield. But this week, I don't believe Andy Dalton start. He's a sit with most teams playing. Jaden Daniels, top 3-4 quarterback, worst case this season, with his running ability. Him and Terry McLaurin on the same page. Zach Ertz playing good football and a great matchup versus a weak Panther defense. He's a must-start. Chiefs at the Niners, Super Bowl rematch. I'm going to start both these quarterbacks. I know they've struggled at times, especially Patrick Mahomes, this season. But I believe coming off a bye week, getting some of these players into the playbook a little bit more, sorting this offense out, I think Patrick Mahomes surprises people, goes out there versus a tough Niner defense in a big ball game and has a big performance. Because believe it or not, this Chief team, their offense hasn't been good this season, and it could only go up from here, I believe. Even with Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown, and Pacheco out of the lineup, you still got Patrick Mahomes. They're still 5-0 on the season. And I think this game, Mahomes goes out there and proves he's still an elite quarterback in terms of fantasy football and putting numbers up. Brock Purdy a start. I know this Chief defense, one of the best units in all pro football. Well, Purdy's starting to connect now. Deebo Samuel had a big game last week, 102 yards, a touchdown. George Kittle, he's been a monster, the best tight end. Him and Brock Bowers arguably this season in fantasy football. And you know they want vengeance after losing in the Super Bowl last season. So Brock Purdy, the last 2 weeks, he's gone out there, he put up some fantasy points. I know it's been easier matchups. This is a tough one with Kansas City coming to town. But he's a start for me. New York Jets at the Steelers Sunday night. Aaron Rodgers is sit. Aaron Rodgers has been taking a beating over the last few weeks in the pocket. He's not on the same page most times with his receivers. And we know Robert Saleh got ran out of town, but he really didn't have much to do with the offense. And supposedly Rodgers, he was behind Robert Saleh. It had nothing to do with getting him fired as well. But like I said, the age is showing for Aaron Rodgers. The mobility has gone down, coming off the Achilles injury as well. And this week in a tough matchup at the Pittsburgh Steelers, especially if TJ Watt causes havoc, getting to Aaron Rodgers a few times in that ball game. He's not going to have a good ball game. I believe Justin Fields a borderline option. I know Fields, he's been a solid quarterback over the last few weeks, and he's starting to run the football and get his rushing yards up, as well as Justin Fields. But this is a tough matchup versus a New York Jet defense that gets to the quarterback, holds their opponents down for the most part, mid-teens, low 20s. And also, this Jet defense manufactures points where they put their offense in good position. So I think this week, Justin Fields, he's still a borderline option. And who knows if they could pull him out of the ball game and put Russell Wilson in if he's struggling, even though I wouldn't go that way. They're 4-2 with Fields in the lineup. I know he's been inconsistent at times, but for the most part, believe it or not, he's been a top 10 option this year. Baltimore Ravens at the Bucs, first of 2 Monday Night Football games. Lamar Jackson, best quarterback in fantasy this season. He's putting up numbers each and every week. Even in a bad game, he's still scoring that 20-25 fantasy points. And this Tampa Bay secondary really can't stop anyone, even though they got reinforcements back in last week's game. We still saw Spencer Rattler go out there and have a decent performance. So Lamar locked in once again. Baker Mayfield, same thing. He's matchup proof. He's putting up huge numbers. When you got Mike Evans, Chris Godwin in the offense, now Sean Tucker emerging, Bucky Irvin been solid as well in the backfield. They got a lot of weapons on this offense, is Tampa Bay. And Baker Mayfield, he's been matchup proof, and he's been a top 5 quarterback in fantasy circles. And a start this week in the Chargers at the Arizona Cardinals, another 2 Monday Night Football weeks. And Herbert, a borderline option. It's been more of the running game doing the damage and the defense putting the offense in better positions, and a lot of stalling out in the red zone as well for this Charger team. So Justin Herbert, he really hasn't done much this season. His ceiling's been 15, 17 fantasy points. And even this week, in a plus matchup in a weak defense of the Arizona Cardinals, I don't see Justin Herbert doing much in this ball game. He's a borderline option. Kyler Murray, a start for me in this one. I know Murray, the last 3 out of 4 weeks, he's failed to score 20 or more fantasy points. But this is a decent matchup with the Chargers coming to town. I know Marvin Harrison might be out in this ball game, but it's a decent matchup, like I said. And Kyler Murray, throughout his career, we know he's been a better home quarterback than he's been on the road. So that's quarterback start sits every matchup for week 7 of the fantasy football season.